Believe it or not all cultures manage conflict in the same ways. And so David Augsburger wrote the seminal book, Conflict Mediation Across Cultures. And so we're going to look at some of the highlights of his work, especially through the eyes of API people. This also references the surgery versus acupuncture short reading that you got on e-reserves. But westernized cultures focus on the individual issues, so personal and private ownership. This is very much kind of isolated in an individual way. Traditional cultures see conflict as a communal concern, and so there is definitely a group ownership. Like people, you can't box or contain the conflict. It affects more than just the combatants or the people who are having a problem. Westernized cultures prefer direct one-to-one encounter between the disputants that uses a third party only in extremity or in legal process. In other words, when you have to hire a lawyer, it's really extreme. Individualism in life shapes individualism in strife. So very much those of us who took psychology in Western academic settings, conflict resolution, even in Christian context, a lot of times we are told to avoid triangulation. If you've heard that term, it's really supposed to be just one-on-one. And I think certainly there's a kind of a biblical precedent. When you're about to give your gift at the altar, and then you realize that you have a conflict with someone that's unresolved, you leave your gift, right, one-on-one, and you go and you resolve the conflict. The idea of involving a third party is really considered bad form. Traditional cultures deal with conflict in preferred patterns of mediation through third parties. Resolution is achieved in indirect, lateral, and systemic ways. So again, this is where the illustration of surgery, you go directly to the source of the pain, the problem, the disease. You make cuts, it's bloody, you remove things, and oftentimes the recovery is long. Whereas in kind of more Asian, especially East Asian cultures, the whole idea of acupuncture is you go indirect. So if you have a pain like a headache, you go to an acupuncture site that is not in your head, and many times it's not invasive. It's certainly not bloody, and the recovery is pretty minimal. And so, using third parties in traditional cultures is very much more of an indirect or acupuncture approach. Westernized cultures see conflict as situationally defined, with open options for pragmatic choice. So what works today may be very different from what worked in identical situation yesterday. Traditional cultures follow conflict patterns embedded in the mores and customs of the group or people. So the resolution processes are culturally prescribed. So you can be more of a freewheeler in the Western approach to conflict resolution. You can, free to freestyle, and apply what you think is going to work best here. Versus in more traditional cultures, just like, you need to go to an elder or you need to go to a parent. You can't just go straight to, let's say, the other party. And these things are kind of embedded in the cultural patterns. For example, old Chinese proverb, do not remove a fly from your neighbor's face with a hatchet. So even though maybe a Western counselor would say, go straight at them, tell them why you're mad, don't hold back, be honest about your feelings. Chinese proverb, more of an Eastern way, is to say, maybe that approach is over the top. Augsburger talks about face work, and this is the primary experience of interpersonal conflict. It's a universal human process, a ubiquitous concept present in the thought and life of all cultures. So it's not just Asian cultured people that have concern about face, okay? But it's the degree to which face work comes into play when mediating conflict. So, for example, individualistic cultures seek to minimize anxiety and shame while socializing the child to function predominantly by guilt direction. So, Western culture is very much a guilt-focused culture. And so you feel bad because you've done something wrong, and then you accept your punishment, and then we're good. You're clear. Sociocentric cultures, as opposed to individualistic cultures, develop shame functions to levels of mature, sensitive, interpersonal moral relationships. So this, when you're sociocentric, not individually centric, you're concerned about your family, your group, your community, and their acceptance or rejection is very much at stake when you're dealing with problems. So let's take a look at this. Since the child in development was socialized by a larger number of parenting figures in a sociocentric culture, and by processes that model and form controls along patterns of external responsibility to external ideals held by the community, the experience of shame has clear external reference. So, in other words, in more sociocentric cultures, it's not just your mom and dad that are around you. If you had much older siblings, they also kind of function like parental figures. But, I remember growing up, my aunts and uncles, my grandparents, even the quasi-aunts and uncles at church, we call them auntie and uncle so-and-so. All of those people, not just my literal mom and dad, were part of kind of keeping me in line. I didn't want to disappoint any of those people. Faith must be honored, respected, preserved, and enhanced in all human relationships. So this again is coming from a sociocentric cultural perspective that you can't just think about. You can't just ignore faith. In Western cultures, the loss of faith is rarely reckoned in conflict strategies or identified as a factor in disruptive encounters, but it is an element in any alienation. So if it occurs, the focus is on the self's loss of faith. So in other words, if it does come into play, it's usually the individual, him or herself, who's concerned about losing faith. They're not necessarily even concerned about somebody else losing faith. In the East and throughout the Southern Hemisphere, the concept of faith covers both self-esteem and the esteem of the other. So not just the person, but the opponent. Affirmed and reflected regard, felt and recognized worth, and pride and social significance. And I would argue that my experience, especially with Asian American cultures, is that the concern for the esteem of the other actually supersedes self-esteem. So there's always the concern of losing, the other person losing face, not so much yourself losing face. I noticed as a Chinese American married to a Japanese American, the Japanese American have an even greater heightened sense of other losing face. So that's why I remember when my wife started working in the secular corporate business world, she picked up, for a Japanese bank, she picked up a book in J-Town that said, 16 ways to say no in Japanese without ever saying no. Because it's just considered really gauche, really bad form if you put the other person in a position where they actually have to turn you down, tell you no. I remember when early on, maybe 3 decades ago, when Campus Crusade for Christ Now crew was in Japan, and they were going around with what they called then the 4 spiritual laws, and they would just kind of walk up to strangers on the street in Japan, and they would do their normal thing, take them through the booklet, and at the end, they would ask them, would you like to pray the sinner's prayer? And many of the people would pray the prayer. And so they would go back, and usually these are Americans, they would go back and they would report to their supervisor, we had all of these decisions for Christ on the street today, but most of those people who supposedly became Christians never ended up darkening the doors of a local church. And in retrospect, it's because the Japanese that they were witnessing to realized that the only way that they could get out of this confrontation without either one of them losing face, especially the one who's doing the witnessing, was simply to pray the prayer without meaning it. Does that make sense? So it's quite fascinating to me when you kind of mix these two approaches to face. What is not covered in Augsburger's book is the stages of healthy human development that was popularized by Doctors Henry Cloud and John Townsend. And I really have embraced their simple model because I think it applies to all human beings across all cultures. But then it's also interesting to look at it through the lens of a sociocentric population. So stage one is the bonding stage. And, basically they're saying that when any of us is first born into the world, we need to have an experience of bonding, certainly from our parents. And for those of us who come from this larger extended circle of parent figures, it's this, we're a gift to all of them. And it's nothing that we've done to deserve it. We are just celebrated, and it's wonderful. Now, for various reasons and circumstances, some babies and young children are denied this full sense of feeling bonded. Maybe one of the parents was killed in a car accident, or maybe there's another child, maybe older in the family, who's got special needs, and it takes up a lot of time and energy. But we need to finish this first stage of bonding before we can get on to the next stage. The next stage is called boundaries. So this is where you're sufficiently bonded. Your worth is rooted in that sense of bonding and worth. But now you need to start to differentiate. And so at kind of the teenage, young adult years, especially with brain development, the prefrontal lobe, this is where it's normal and natural for most human beings to now start to differentiate from all these parental figures and to say, well, who am I? I mean, I'm still bonded to them, but I'm not them. Like, I have my own individuality. What are my thoughts? What do I think? What do I believe? And when there's sufficient boundaries and the person has individuated, it's also important, though, to reach a stage of integrating goodness and badness. That's where I put the symbol of the yin-yang. And it's realized, like, okay, so this is where I think a maturing person realizes that no one is 100% bad or 100% good, that there are shades of gray. And, like the same situation could be both good and bad, maybe more good than bad or bad than good. But you're not so simple of saying it's all bad or it's all good. And I think a lot of people don't get to this stage, and they still kind of live in that black and white world. The ultimate development, according to Cloud and Townsend, is where you're differentiated enough and you're integrated enough where you, at some point, become a peer with the other adults in your life. So, you are still the offspring of your parents, or you're still the nephew or niece of your aunts and uncles, but, at the same time, you have a job, you're living on your own, maybe you've established your own family, and so now you don't have to be afraid of disappointing each other or disappointing them. It's like, you're an adult, taking your place alongside of them. Now, thinking about this through the API lens, I would say that we are so sociocentric, many of us, so we kind of major in the first stage, bonding, but it's a very conditional bonding. And so we live with this fear of disappointment, of getting kicked out because we've, crossed the line and we've failed. We brought scandal, everyone's lost face because of something we've done or haven't done. And so this stage of bonding that never kind of develops the boundaries to integration and into adult peership is a form of bondage. I think this is where shame can really control us. And I think for a lot of us with this cultural background, there's even this kind of hang up in our relationship with God that we never really truly experience being this gift, loved unconditionally, total unbelievable worth that's coming from this amazing God who made us. We're all still living in fear of disappointing this God. So again, it's really important to differentiate, to integrate, and to become peers. If you think about it in Asian American church settings, especially if you grew up in a church as a young person, it may in some settings be almost impossible, even though you're like 45 and you have a doctorate and whatever. It may be impossible for you to feel like a peer of people who are older than you or ahead of you, or even relating to your senior pastor, because they don't recognize that God designed this flow of development so that we all become brother and sister in Christ. I mean, one of the things that I really see in this is that, when we get to heaven, the only relationship that's going to be true in heaven is brother and sister in Christ. Not even marriage, from the way I read Scripture. Not even marriage, husband and wife, is going to be there. So this is part, I think, of the peership that comes because of Jesus Christ. So we need to balance our God-designed development, which we just went through, with our Asian American cultural proclivities. So on the one hand, there's this tendency on the left to kind of keep us all in this kind of young, dependent, certainly conditional shame bondage in its worst forms, versus, I think, the westernized or American side, which is moving towards individuation, more individualism. And so for Asian American people, we're kind of living in this teeter-totter tension at many times. In conflict, from the Western perspective, the individualist finds the greatest threat to face comes from an attack on the need for autonomy and the loss of control over self and others. The threat to the person's face makes him or her look childish or incompetent. So again, I think if you think about President Donald Trump, I don't think that he has any concern. He hasn't displayed any concern for other people losing face because of something he said or did. But he definitely feels attacks to his face. Right? So that's the individualist to an extreme. When a conflict breaks out for a person in a more collectivist setting, the threat to face comes from the possible loss of inclusion, approval, and association by others. So just the fear of being excluded, of being kind of turned out, turned away, being treated as an outcast, branded, for the rest of your life, that's enough to keep many collectivist people from ever trying to individuate or voicing in some public way disagreement or disapproval. And again, this can actually cause some people to just feel like crippled emotionally and developmentally. And so sometimes they end up having to leave just to grow up. Augsburger talks about non-confrontational ways that conflict is managed. One is anticipatory management. And this is where the person anticipates conflict, diffuses it, and manages it in a preventive way before it happens. So you see this, if you keep going down this road, there's going to be a train wreck, and so you're always kind of making sure that the wreck doesn't happen. Number two, there's negative communication. Silence, avoidance, evasion, and absence may show disagreement or even anger without confrontation. I think this is where kind of the infamous passive aggressiveness that many people say about if they're not Asian Pacific Islanders, say, the Asian Pacific Islanders are so passive aggressive. They don't say it when they're upset, but they just kind of let you know in indirect ways. Number three is situational friendliness. So this code switching allows persons who avoid each other to assume friendliness when necessary in unavoidable public settings. Oh my goodness. This happens in Christian settings so many times. I'm sure you've experienced this. I've experienced this definitely. Where, I think for me, when I was at the same church for 39 years. And so I've seen thousands of people come and go. And some people didn't leave on the best terms. And sometimes, I think that I was one of the primary reasons why they left. And then you run into each other at some Christian gathering or you bump into each other in the mall. And, it's initially awkward, but everyone's just kind of not talking about, the fact that there was a parting of the ways. Number 4, triadic mediation. So conflict between A and B may be reduced or managed indirectly by a go-between C. In Japanese, this C person is called the baishakunin. It's the one who arranges a marriage, let's say. So again, in Western conflict mediation, they would not support this triadic mediation. But if this is a way to actually save face by the two people not directly confronting each other, if you think about that, again, that by Verston Choi, that short reading on e-reserves, where they got the kind of quietly warring factions in that little Japanese American church to actually confront each other. It's like they shut down the church after they did that because they couldn't face each other after that. Displacement. Anger or disapproval of one party is conveyed to another who is more vulnerable or whose retaliation is less threatening. Also as projection, gossip, prayer request, and curses. A lot of times, let's say, I'm an elder in the church, or I'm a pastor, and someone said something to me at church that really upset me, but I don't dare get mad at them, and so I come home and I yell at my dog, right? Or I take it out on my wife or my kids. That's certainly there. I think this other thing about gossip and, even, I have a prayer request, for this person. All those kind of things are not direct ways of actually dealing with the conflict. So again, this is not conflict mediation, or resolution, it's conflict management. Number 6, self-aggression. One party may express a grievance by exaggerated compliance. An apology by a victim may be rebellion through obedience. It can be self-destructive sacrifice, self-accusation where you blame self, or self-aggression where you hurt yourself. I've been part of a more closed Asian American Christian group, more progressive people, and without getting into all the details, the people who moderate the group, who found this to be a very empowering space because they are not heterosexual male API people, they're pretty unempathetic or unsympathetic to those of us who are straight males when we try to bring up concerns. And basically, it's been my experience, and some others like me, who basically your only option is to apologize. It's like they're not going to listen to you. Now, I don't take it as far as then I blame myself. I have my own worth, and I don't feel like it becomes something self-destructive for me. But it might be for some other people. I just kind of know, okay, I know what's going on, and there's just no point in this. And then finally, number 7, acceptance. The conflict situation can be accepted with equanimity. Instead of rejecting or correcting an undesirable state of affairs, the person accepts it as destiny, absorbs it in resignation, maybe sees it as fate, or it's just karma. That's so Buddhist, right? It's just like, everyone's not going to get along all the time. And, maybe, intelligent, faithful people are just going to disagree and maybe never be able to see, things the same way. Or it's just like, maybe I deserve this. That's the kind of the karmic fate thing. It's like, maybe I didn't hurt this person, but I've hurt other people in the past. And so, this is kind of coming back to haunt me. What goes around comes around kind of thing. But you don't feel a need to go out and constantly work out all the conflicts. Augsburger ends with this. These are all forms of non-confrontational management, not of conflict resolution. The very same cultural values of guilt consciousness and avoidance may both intensify conflict and be used for its management, and what is ultimately aimed at is an empty, egoless, joyful, and thus conflict-free self. So, wouldn't that be nice, where we're kind of Buddha-like, where we get to this place where we just don't worry, we don't have desire. People basically can't upset us because we don't have expectations. It's nice on paper. I don't know that it actually works out that way. But I hope that whether you read the book or you just kind of, listen to this lecture, that you can at least minimally appreciate that not all cultures, especially comparing East to West, not all cultures manage or resolve conflict in the same way, and that there are definitely different approaches that we would all do well to be aware of.